Hello and welcome back to Quiet Riot Sunday School, a little halfway purgatory before Thursday's heaven. I'm Alex Andreu. As I hope you will have noticed, we are making a real effort to cover the election result from as many party and nation angles as possible. If you haven't yet caught our Northern Ireland explainer with Amanda Ferguson, or the interview with the Green Party's Zach Polanski, I highly recommend them. Today is dedicated to Scotland, and I have with me the journalist, broadcaster, Scot indie activist, LGBT plus icon, and former SNP MP, John Nicolson. Hello, John.
Hello, that's the first time anyone has called me a former MP, so that's a bit of a milestone.
I take it as a massive compliment that I am the first person to whom you're talking to on the record after the election. I know that losing your seat was a shock, but the result was broadly in line with how the Scottish vote shares moved in general. Did that national swing ultimately feel irresistible, or were there constituency-specific stuff going on?
I didn't think I was going to lose. All the various websites had me down as winning, and even the bookies, and you don't meet many poor bookies, do you? So they seemed to think that I was going to win. So I was shocked, and I'm very sad to lose. Inasmuch, after a week's reflection, inasmuch as I can work out what happened in my own constituency, which was a new constituency. There was only 50% of the previous constituency in the new constituency after boundary changes. The Tories seem to have voted Labour en masse to get rid of me. I think some independent supporters voted Labour because they wanted to get rid of the Tories. And then there was a very low turnout, so a lot of people just stayed at home. So that was a perfect storm, really, which resulted in me losing my seat. And you know, Alex, politicians are often very vain and they think it's all about them. They think they've won or they've lost as a personal rejection. But the truth is people vote for parties. And my friend Angus Robertson, the Cabinet Secretary for Culture, has analysed these figures very closely going back many years.
Yeah.
And he reckons a good candidate can possibly add 5%, and a poor candidate can possibly lose 5%. But overall, it's all about the party. And there was an electoral wave which individual candidates such as myself found impossible to resist.
While you were out there campaigning, what sort of response were you getting on the doorstep? Were there signs that made you worried that maybe the bookies and the polls weren't quite right?
Not really. I didn't detect any enthusiasm whatsoever for Keir Starmer or Labour. People didn't seem to have a clear sense of what they stood for, which I think was probably deliberate. I think Labour was very keen that nothing could be pinned on them. So their offering was very vague. If I would sit at the doorstep or stand at the doorstep, or given that I'm waiting for hip surgery, sort of stagger towards the doorstep, when you talk on the doorstep to people and compare SNP policy with Labour policy, they always preferred the SNP policies on everything, you know, on the Scottish child payment, on Brexit, on a host of other issues. If you told them truthfully what the two parties' policies were, they would go for the SNP's policy. There were certainly some people picked up on the stuff about the SNP that we've been reading about, you know, Nicola Sturgeon's camper van, for example, and all this kind of nonsense. A few people have picked up on that. But no, we thought our vote was holding up pretty well. And, you know, in the end, if you look behind the figures, because it's extraordinary the way it's been covered, I'm not underestimating in any way what happened, but the SNP vote was 30%. And the all-conquering Labour Party's vote was 35%. So there's only 5% between it. And Labour is now claiming that this is a mandate to do what they want. It's a crushing mandate, which is kind of curious because when the SNP had more than 40%, nobody in the Labour Party ever said, well, that's an overwhelming mandate that we've got to listen to. So there's a lot of spin surrounding this result. But obviously, something that we've got to think about quite carefully is why is it that over 50% of the population now consistently support independence, but the SNP only attracted 30% at the polls?
Yeah.
Where did that 20% go? And what can we do to get it back and get it voting SNP? Because people can vote whatever they like at Holyrood elections because there's a proportional system. But at Westminster elections, if you vote for parties that are other than the SNP, it will always be represented as a vote against independence by the press. And people have got to realise that. There's no point voting for the Labour Party if you support independence, because they're not going to give you a referendum, or at least they're going to do their best to avoid giving you a referendum.
I sense from talking to people who support the Scottish independence cause that Brexit is a slight problem bubbling under the surface. I mean, it is both a spur to independence because effectively a lot of Scottish people feel they were lied to when they were told, you know, if you become independent, you lose your EU membership, only to be dragged out of the EU a couple of years later. But at the same time, it feels like the difficulties of the divorce, the upheaval that splitting from the EU has caused, has served as a sort of example for people in Scotland to the sort of difficulty and upheaval they might look forward to if there is Scottish independence. So how do you think that plays into the argument?
I think in 2014, when we had our referendum, the EU card was played very successfully by unionists. And a lot of people were worried that we would be pulled out of the European Union if we became independent, and we might struggle to get back in. And, you know, people kept talking about Spain and Catalonia. I always thought it was nonsense myself, but obviously Downing Street had friends in Brussels who were quite happy to remain silent and allow the impression that Scotland would find EU membership difficult. And of course, we were told that if we stayed in the Union, not only would we stay in the European Union as a result of staying in the United Kingdom, but we would be central to the United Kingdom. Remember, the slogan was, "Don't leave us, lead us."
Yeah.
Well, what we saw after 2014 was a complete reversal of all those promises. You know, Gordon Brown strutted around the country making promises he couldn't possibly keep because he was a former Prime Minister and not a member of the ruling party. And I thought that was fundamentally dishonest of him. And then we were dragged out of the European Union against our will. Now, the mood in Brussels has changed. Downing Street has few friends in Brussels these days. And I know from talking to EU ambassadors that they're very keen to see Scotland back in the European Union. Why? Because Scotland is the kind of country that they want. It would be a net contributor. It's got a highly educated population. It's got no corruption. It's got very strong infrastructure. It has a geographically immensely important position. And on renewables, wind and power, for example, its role is likely to be incredibly crucial as we consider our energy future. So I think they want more Denmarks, is basically what the EU thinks. And Scotland would be that.
I get that completely, but I think you are slightly ducking the question, which is, do you not get a sense that people's support for Scottish independence is holding up extremely well, but the chosen timing for Scottish independence might be a little bit in the not right now space?
The Scots are very cautious. Of course, people think about it carefully, and they've decided to use the Labour Party as a vehicle to get rid of the Tory. That's a real problem for the Labour Party because it's got to both please red wall Tories who are far to the right of the average Scot, have quite a xenophobic view about foreigners, about immigration, about our European neighbours. And they've got to somehow or other please them and they've also got to please Scots. And they did that by saying almost nothing in the election, but they're now in government and they can't do that anymore. But I think the really important thing to look at when we consider the future is the demography. Yeah. The only group now who supports the United Kingdom are the over 65s, and under 65s are increasingly strongly pro-independence. If you're a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old, you really want Scotland to be back in the European Union because you want all the advantages that my generation, your generation had.
I think anywhere, actually, in any nation, if you look at that demographic, they want the UK.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there is a strong support amongst younger people for EU membership, and I don't think they're going to be fearties, as we say north of the border, about the downside, because we've listened to Project Fear so many times now that I think it's lost its power to terrify. That's my sense. I might be wrong, but that's what I think. And I certainly think that in the ongoing debate, the fact that the European Union and the European Union members can't be rolled out to participate in Project Fear as they were a decade ago, the significance of that cannot be underestimated. And then, of course, there's also the issue of oil and energy. I mean, even people who don't pay close attention to these matters were told in 2014 the oil was about to run out. And a decade later, we're told that oil is absolutely crucial to the UK's economic future.
More licenses. You mentioned the demography. Are the Scottish Greens more of a threat that the SNP should be paying a bit more attention to? Because they tend to be quite attractive to young voters and also support independence. So is that maybe something that the party needs to keep a closer eye on?
Well, we handled the Greens very badly, I think, in the Holyrood Agreement, the Bute House Agreement that we had. It was clearly mishandled. And you're right, young people are attracted to the Greens. One of the reasons, and I think you know, that I was very outspoken on the issue of trans rights, as well as LGBT rights in particular, was because, like a lot of young people, I'm not in favour of Scottish independence because I want to get out there and wave a big saltire flag and shout, you know, here's to us wha's like us, damn few. I mean, I'm not a flag fetishist. One of the reasons that I support Scottish independence is because of the kind of society that we can build. I remember in the run-up to the second referendum that we had on devolution in 97, a lot of people in the Labour Party who were anti-devolution used to argue that we shouldn't have a Scottish Parliament because we needed England to keep us liberal. I think that was Brian Wilson's position, for example. Well, look at us now.
That's changed, hasn't it?
Hasn't it just changed? And I think it's wonderful that Scotland, on a whole number of metrics, is now amongst the most liberal and most gay-friendly countries in Europe. And perhaps the decline in religion has played a role in that as well. We're one of few countries now where more than 50% of the population declares themselves to be atheist or agnostic and not religious, according to the last census. So I was very concerned when we were having our debates about trans rights that the right wing, the moral right, as the Americans used to call it, who were so opposed to trans rights but supported independence, would give cause for concern amongst young people about what an independent Scotland might look like. Because everything that we do and say should be to build a society that is attractive and shows how an independent Scotland, with all the powers of independence, would be. So I was delighted when, at this recent election, Alex Salmond and his cohort ran on their awful right-wing, MAGA-style, anti-trans agenda and ended up with 0.5%, 0.5% of the vote. They lost their deposit in every race that they fought. And one of their champions one of the MPs that flipped from the SNP to ALPA, in his own constituency, he went from first to seventh. That must be the biggest drop for any sitting MP in any parliamentary election in history, I would have thought. And that's what the Scottish people actually thought about politicians who'd weaponised transphobia. It's not what the Scottish population want. It's certainly not what young people want. And so I think having seen off that lot, and I'm glad they left the SNP and set up their own party, perhaps the threat of the Greens in Westminster elections will be lessened. I'm very happy for people to vote Green at Holyrood because of the PR system. But voting Green at a Westminster election just allows unionists to win. So I don't really see why the Greens do it. It serves no purpose.
Can I ask you, in the middle of what must have been just a horrible, devastating feeling of losing your own seat, was there a tiny, tiny part of you that was also a little bit elated beyond partisanship to see the Tories go?
I don't think I experienced any elation at all, I'm afraid, on the night. I was surrounded by my staff crying. That's what people often forget. It's not just the MP who loses his or her job, it's the staff who are all made unemployed. And I've got a wonderful staff. My office is filled with flowers and chocolates sent to them as thank yous for solving often terribly difficult cases. You've got to remember that MPs are the last port of call frequently for people who are in terrible trouble. And the staff's job is to try and resolve very difficult issues often. And it never gets publicity because the cases are often private and they have to be kept private. So they were all very distressed. I was trying to comfort them. I would like to have sat down in front of my TV and enjoyed multiple Portillo moments. You know, Rees-Mogg losing his seat.
Liz Truss,
and others.
I mean, come on.
I might watch it in a couple of months. I mean, I say all that. I'm conscious as well of the fact that Rees-Mogg has staff and Liz Truss has staff, and, you know, they've all lost their jobs as well. So I'm uncomfortable in celebrating people's defeats, I suppose, although I might make an exception for Truss and Mogg.
The support for the SNP has held up, actually, in terms of percentages, relatively well. Support for independence has held up relatively well. So are we looking at the 2026 Holyrood election as the next springboard, I think, to take the party forward? What do you think John Sweeney needs to put right? Or maybe you don't think it should be John Sweeney that takes the party forward. Maybe you think now is the time for a change of leadership.
No, I thought John Sweeney had a very good election. I've known him for a long time. I don't know him terribly well, but I've known him for a long time. His wife was in the audience of the first programme I ever did as a youth presenter for the BBC called Open to Question, and she was one of the kids in the audience. He's very much the way he seems. He's quite old-fashioned. He is serious-minded. He is courteous and gentlemanly and polite. I think he's an all-round good guy, is my take on him. Socially progressive and liberal, on the left in politics, in favour of progressive taxation, the kind of stuff that I believe in. I think, I hesitate to say this because I've interviewed politicians who say this, and it's always such a cliche. But I think we've done a poor job of letting people know what the Scottish Government has stood for. I don't think the average Scot is aware of how different it is in England. I mean, when my mum had dementia, she got 4 daily visits of an hour each visit and didn't have to sell her house. You don't get that in England. You don't get free university tuition in England. And I'm the first generation of my family to go to university. My grandma left school when she was 12. And I went to university and ended up getting a scholarship to Harvard. It transformed my life, and it was free university education. You know, we don't have water in private hands. It's in public hands, and the SNP nationalised the railways. And the Scottish Child Payment, I think, is transformative in reducing poverty. And again, you don't have that in England, and Labour has pledged to keep the two-child benefit cap, which is a monstrous thing. I don't think the average Scot realises that these things are things that the SNP government has passed, often in the teeth of Labour opposition at Holyrood, and that south of the border it's a very different situation. We've got to do a better job of explaining what we're doing and why. We're not very good at the media, often, I don't think. We've got a hostile media, but we can't do anything about that, so we've just got to have better communicators, I think, than we often do. Labour, as I said, I don't think there was an enthusiasm for Labour. I think it was used as a vehicle. And Keir Starmer didn't appear on any of the leaflets as far as I could see. They didn't seem to think in the Scottish Labour Party that he was an asset. So they've got 2 years. Let's see what they do in those 2 years. I think we could well see buyer's remorse. And another one of these big swings that Scotland has now become famous for is people move back to the SNP.
That wouldn't surprise me at all, because I think people have an innate sense that maybe it's healthier to have a national parliament that is not of the same stripe as the Westminster Parliament, and maybe it is actually healthier to have that tension between the two, to have someone that represents Scottish interests, you know, in a way that is not in any sense beholden to the Westminster government. I can fully see that happening.
I also think we've got to have a mature adult discussion about how Scotland leaves the United Kingdom if we want to leave it. Because my whole adult lifetime, we've always been told that it was a voluntary union and Scotland could choose to leave. Even Margaret Thatcher said that the route to Scotland becoming independent was a majority of SNP MPs elected at Westminster. That used to be her rule of thumb.
Yeah.
So if you have a party that runs on a manifesto promising to deliver an independence referendum, and if Holyrood as a parliament then votes for that, as Holyrood has done, then Scotland should have the right to hold an independence referendum. And I think it's constitutionally outrageous that Keir Starmer, who spent much of his life campaigning for independence movements around the world, he now finds himself in a position as a kind of Ian Paisleyite unionist, perhaps the wrong name to use given what happened to Paisley Jr. at the election. But we've got Keir Starmer now apparently saying that Scotland has no right to leave ever. Well, I always used to correct people when they called Scotland a colony. You know, some of the nationalists would refer to Scotland as a colony. I would say it's not a colony, it's ridiculous to call it a colony. But really, if there is no mechanism to leave, and we're told we can never leave, we can never have a referendum, well, it's not a voluntary union. And I struggle to get Anas Sarwar or any of his pals ever to tell us what the mechanism for leaving now is. And of course they don't want to refer it. That's what they always answer. They always say, oh, I don't support independence, which is a non sequitur. I'm not asking them to support independence. Perfectly entitled
You're asking
to campaign
about the mechanism.
Exactly. But they won't say. And I know why they can't say. They can't say because that then locks them into agreeing to the mechanism. And there's a reason they don't want another referendum. And I think that's because they know they'd lose.
Let me take you outside the Scotland sphere and ask you a couple of quick, more general questions, because, of course, you were a very long-standing member of the DCMS committee. You really have an interest in that sphere. Are you sad that Thangam Debonair lost her seat, and how do you think Lisa Nandy will do as Secretary of State with that brief?
No, I'm not at all sad that Thangam Debonair lost her seat. I don't know her personally. I was never particularly impressed by her in Parliament or her contributions. And I have a personal story with her, which is that when I proposed that Nadine Dorris was sent to Privileges, the Privileges Committee, for lying to Parliament, lying to our committee about a Channel 4 series that she'd appeared in where she claimed that all the other participants were actors, was untrue. And that's a serious thing to lie to a committee, which she did. And I wrote to the Speaker and said to the Speaker, this is a serious business. I think she should be sent to Privileges. The Speaker responded to me, and when I publicised his response, he then wanted to send me to Privileges for revealing his decision.
I remember that. I remember that episode.
It was a shocker. And who should be leaping up and down from the Labour benches to argue for me being sent to Privileges but Thangham Debonair on what surely was a basic question of open democracy, that if the Speaker makes a decision, the public have a right to know what the Speaker's decision was. And Labour initially told me that they would support me and then did a U-turn, and Thangham Debonair led the charge. It was an overt act of political tribalism. It came right in the end, of course, because I was cleared by the Privileges Committee, but absurd that I followed Boris Johnson into a parliamentary court where I was tried by mostly my political opponents. And Thangham Debonair was the person who was most keen to see me there. I mean, that was a shocker. So, no, I didn't really feel any, not just because of that, which obviously I wasn't pleased about. I didn't rate her particularly. Lisa Nandy, I've always got on quite well with her personally, but she said some very stupid stuff about Scotland, comparing it with Catalonia, appearing to welcome the police response to the Catalan independence referendum, which was a dreadful thing to say given how violent it was. You know, on a one-to-one basis, I've always found Lisa Nandy, a nice person to deal with. Even setting aside some of the silly things she said, I don't think we should set aside silly things that people say. I think we should remember them and challenge them.
Oh, I'm all for setting them aside, as someone who has said many silly things.
Well, there you are. We've all said silly things. We've mostly not defended coshing people over the head, though, with batons. I don't think I've ever done that. I doubt you've ever done that either. I wish Lisa good luck. It's a wonderful job. I hope she gets the chance to stick at it, because I think I was the opposite number for 9 different secretaries of state.
It's extraordinary.
In the course of, it's ludicrous. It's used as a kind of training ground for other offices, and I can't think of a better cabinet post, and it's really important, especially in issues like broadcasting, Ofcom, the role of GB News and other channels in disseminating disinformation, touring visas for artists post-Brexit, a whole host of really important issues. Something I would like to see, and I've asked Labour repeatedly about this, I don't think that big party donors who've given huge amounts of money should be rewarded with plum public service posts. We saw that with Richard Sharp at the BBC, who was eventually defenestrated. I think Labour should have said, we won't do that. If you give a lot of money to Labour, you won't get a great job as a reward. But they've refused to say that, and I think that's wrong.
Let's see what they do. I mean, we've had quite a few years of people saying one thing and doing the opposite. So I think I am personally ready to judge people by what they do rather than what they promise pre-election. On the Tory leadership, I mean, as an LGBT campaigner, were you gratified to see just how badly those awful comments by Suella Braverman went down? I didn't expect it. I thought she was going to ingratiate herself with them, and the reaction seems to have been universal condemnation. As someone remarked on Twitter, which made me laugh, she's lost all her mates and all the gays.
Well, she's a sort of pantomime baddie, isn't she, really? The Tories are a funny lot, you know. Like you, I grew up with Clause 28 and all the ghastliness of what they did. And then when I was elected and I looked across the Tory benches, it soon became clear that the Tories were almost certainly homosexual unless there was clear evidence to the contrary. I'm talking about Tory MPs. I mean, it was like a night out in Soho looking across at them.
A friend of mine says there's gay and there's public school gay, and the two are very easily confused.
Yes, that may well be the case. The first trans MP was a Tory MP. The culture war that they engaged in was a horrible regression to a previous Tory past. A particular low point, I thought, was when that wee trans girl who'd been murdered and her mum appeared in the gallery of the Commons, and Rishi Sunak decided to say something transphobic on the day that she appeared in the Commons. What on earth was he doing? Just horrible. And, you know, like our own party, the Labour Party has indulged transphobic elements. I think. I mean, there's one ghastly transphobic Labour Party politician who's indulged. And Keir Starmer himself, if I understood him correctly, said in the course of the election campaign that he doesn't think that trans kids should be taught about trans identity at school. I mean, it's nonsense. I don't believe he thinks that for a moment. We mustn't allow ourselves to be dragged backwards by the evil forces of transphobia on Twitter, the right-wing tabloids, and all the others who are trying to stoke culture wars in this country. We must stand up and be counted. And we know, as I said earlier about Scotland, we know that out in the real world, real voters don't care about this stuff. They mostly just want people to be treated with kindness. And the kind of stuff that we read in the tabloids and on social media doesn't resonate with voters, I don't think. I don't think they're interested in it. I don't think transphobia is a vote winner. Apart from being morally repugnant, I don't think it's a vote winner.
Many people won't know that you worked for a while as a speechwriter on Capitol Hill. So you have a connection to the Democratic Party in the state. I think you wrote primarily for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
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 He was the grand old man of the Senate. He was a very interesting character. When I was at Harvard, I became friends with the man who'd been the executive editor of the Washington Post. He kind of took me under his wing, and he was the man who coined the phrase deep throat. And he asked me what I was going to do.
I hope those two events are completely unrelated.
He asked me what I was going to do, and I've got a place at Harvard Law School, and he said, I think you'd enjoy Washington. And I said, I've got this friend, Senator Pat Moynihan. He's looking for a speechwriter. Why don't you go and meet him? And I was given a very tough interview. Moynihan had served in more cabinets than any other politician in history. He'd been ambassador to the UN. He had grown up in Hell's Kitchen. It was a ferocious interview. He was fiercely clever and interesting. And he got me to write speeches, mostly on gun control, the Middle East, Northern Ireland. Those were the areas that I specialised in. He had a curious style. He thought it was Westminster parliamentary style with exaggerated courtesy and very long parenthetical clauses. So I had to write these really quite pompous sounding speeches, quite ponderous. But he was much loved across the aisle. It was a different period in politics. He had friends in both parties. He could not have imagined a world in which Trump would come to the fore. And of course, Trump has only come to the fore because of the changes in the broadcasting rules of balance that Reagan and Bush Sr. pushed through, which has allowed these rednecks to rant. It's a worry for us in this country, just before we move on, because we've seen how this can go in the United States, because there used to be balance in broadcasting in the United States. Then they allowed the balance to break down. They allowed these folk to rant disinformation at the camera for hours on end to rot the brains of huge swathes of the American population. And we now have a candidate who's effectively a fascist, whom half of America seems to think should be back in the Oval Office. That's a real concern. It's one of the reasons I'm such a champion of public service broadcasting, and why I think Ofcom should stamp on channels like GB News, which are not proper broadcasters but propaganda channels for the right.
There's a part of me that looks at the prospect of a Trump return to the White House and is absolutely terrified. And the practical bit of me says Biden needs to go. But there's also a big part of me that grew up in Greece, which, as you know, reveres older people and their wisdom, that feels incredibly uncomfortable with the way the debate about this has been conducted, to say, you're over a particular age, off you go to the scrap heap. Where are you on this?
Well, I don't think there's a golden rule about it. My mum worked in the post office until she was 80. She did this by lying about her age. So every time she reached 65, she would retire. She would then go to another post office and say she was 60 and get another 5 years as she toured the sub-post offices of Glasgow. And she was eventually caught because when they introduced the computer system, her boss failed, my mum passed, and they told her she'd have to take over. At that stage, she was 80. Her national insurance numbers were written on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and she'd been caught lying. So she said, "See you on Monday," and never went back. So I've no trouble with old people working a long time. One of my closest friends, Krishnan Gurumurthy, his dad, I think, is the oldest medic still working in the NHS full time. Late 80s, I think. So it's not a question of age, but obviously if you do get older, there are particular dangers. And it seems to me, watching Biden in the debate, he's got quite self-evident mental impairment. Obviously not a cold. It's obviously not because he was tired. That's all nonsense. Trump has obviously got mental impairment as well. So there's two mentally impaired candidates running against one another. Obviously, if that was my choice, I'd vote for Biden, but I think he should do the decent thing and stand down. Apart from anything else, I think his policies on a whole range of issues have been awful. Arming Israel, refusing to condemn the war crimes against the Palestinians, his atrocious treatment of Afghan women and girls when he pulled the troops out, leaving them to their fate, despite the fact that American soldiers and Scottish soldiers, English soldiers had died with the promise that they were delivering democracy and human rights to Afghanistan. They died for nothing. And Biden's responsible for pulling out the army. He didn't need to do it. Afghanistan was stabilized. So he has a pretty appalling, I think, legacy in foreign affairs terms. Got better legacy domestically with infrastructure, African-American political engagement. I've got a very good friend whom I met in the Senate way back, used to debate against him as well at university, and he's the senator for Delaware, Chris Coons. He's very close to Biden. He tells me that he thinks Biden is a genuinely good man. He never really gives me a great defense on the stuff I've just mentioned about Israel and Afghanistan. But if Biden wants to do something for his nation now, I think he should stand aside. There's a ready-made candidate sitting there, Kamala Harris. She's already on the ticket, the first woman president, second black president, I think I'd be voting for her and supporting her and pushing her. And I hope vanity doesn't prevent Biden from standing down. But, he might still win, but it doesn't look great, does it?
Okay, John, we were going to have a 20-minute chat, and we've been gabbing for close to an hour, including stuff that we were chatting about before the interview. So, very final question. What's next? You will have the operation. It will go splendidly. You will come out bionic. And what's after that for you? Would you stand as an MSP, or would you want to wait and contest a Westminster seat in 2029, or are you thinking that this might be it politics-wise?
Well, you say you think it'll go well. My last operation was a bit of a disaster. I was woken up after an hour. They couldn't oxygenate me. And I woke up with a group of anaesthetists and surgeons staring down at me in a state of near panic because they'd been unable to oxygenate me and had to wake me up. So that was a bit hair-raising. I'm back in a few weeks later with 4 anaesthetists. And fortunately, that surgery went well. So I'm not super relaxed, to tell you the truth. But with a bit of luck, I'll be okay. I don't know, Alex, is the answer. I don't know what I'm going to do next.
Have the SNP been treating you well as an organisation? Have they been supportive? Because...
Who, the SNP?
Yeah, because what I hear from a lot of people is that... parties in general, this is not a partisan point, but parties in general are really quite bad at aftercare. Like, once you lose that election, there's very little of a support network.
Yes, I think that's true. In fact, at the last election, there was one particular Labour MP that I was friends with who had been defeated. And she was in a terrible state and very distressed and very isolated. And I ended up texting Keir Starmer and saying, I really think you guys have got to look after her because the duty of care is quite important. People don't realise that being a politician, it's a different kind of job, because there's the relationship with the constituency and with your staff and all the casework that you're handling on the day of the election. And losing is not like losing another job. It's a bit like bereavement when you lose. The worst time is the morning when you wake up and you feel that, you're unhappy when you wake up and you quite can't remember. And then you go, oh, that's why I'm so unhappy. Mm-hmm. So it's very sad. Parties often aren't good at it. But, I got a call the day after the election from the First Minister. We chatted for a while on the phone. He wanted to know how I was. He was his usual kind, considerate self. I think some people will find it harder than me. All the people, Alex, who are incredibly obsequious to MPs, who say it would be an honour if they would come to X or Y or Z function, who say, oh, the event wouldn't have been the same if you hadn't come. Thank you so much. I mean, there's the amount of sucking up, as Scots say, to MPs is extraordinary. And then, when MPs lose, so many of these people, they just disappear. The invitations stop. The very respectful tone on the phone disappears. Folk are cynical. And I think some of my colleagues will find that quite hard. The ones who've been there for 10 years, maybe, they were elected in their 20s, they're now pushing 40, that's been their life. They'll find it hard, I think, some of them. And they were good people. I remember Kezia Dugdale, the former leader of the Scottish Labour Party, said that when the SNP was elected in 2015, they looked like Scotland. There was crofters, lawyers, there was a student, there was trade unionists, a breast cancer surgeon, a wide range of people. And a lot of them, well, none of them really had ever thought about going into politics. They were folk who had different lives, all of which they gave up to come to Westminster. And they were so well behaved, weren't they? They turned up, they went to committees,
True.
They bowed deeply before the speaker. One of my colleagues used to curtsy so deeply that I used to worry she wouldn't be able to get back up again. And I think, looking back, we should probably have behaved, a bit worse. I think we should. I think we could have.
No, don't say that, John. Do not regret doing the right thing.
Well, you haven't heard the end of my sentence. I think it's possible to. I think it's possible to be courteous and professional, without completely absorbing all of the ridiculousness. I think we should have carried on clapping instead of making that silly rah, rah, rah noise. I think the honourable and right honourable business is a bit silly. I think we should have scared the speaker a bit more. Bercow very quickly established that we were going to be good little soldiers, and I think Westminster should have been a little bit more apprehensive about the Scots in the way that I think they were when the polls closed in 2015. But that's all something for the historians to analyse. I think. I think it's true that I think they worked incredibly hard, and we're a really decent bunch of people. And I'm sure lots of them will reappear at Holyrood at the next elections. And it'll be interesting to see what they do. People like Mary Black shouldn't leave politics. She's an extraordinary talent.
Agreed.
And I'd like to see much more of her. And a friend of mine, as is Stephen Flynn, who's another talent.
I think I have my answer. It does not sound to me like you're done with politics at all. It sounds to me like you're oozing with passion for the job. Well,
I may have done with elected politics. I've always been political. I enjoy politics. And when I visit schools and kids say to me, what does politics do? What's the point of it? I say to them, do you think that black people shouldn't be allowed to marry white people? Do you think that gay people shouldn't be allowed to hold hands on the street? Do you think women shouldn't be allowed to vote? And of course, they're outraged. They say, of course, black people should be allowed to do whatever they like, and gay people should be allowed to hold hands on the street. Of course women should be allowed to vote. And I say, well, every one of those things was delivered by politics. So politics matters, and it's a force for good. And both as a journalist and as a politician, I have no time for people who say they're all the same, they're all liars. They really aren't. There's good people in all the parties, and there are honest, well-intentioned people in all the parties. And our job as opposition politicians is to keep the government honest, to nourish democracy and the next generation's hopes, and to engage. Don't be lazy. Keep engaged with politics, and keep on hoping for better, because I truly believe the world gets better incrementally, and politics and journalism has a crucial role to play in delivering a better future.
It's a lovely note on which to end this week's Sunday School. Thank you, John Nicolson. It's been a pleasure having you on, and big love to Juliana.
I will pass it. Big love to Nigella.
Remember to take a moment to follow or subscribe to us on your favourite podcast vehicle, and give us a push on social media. The full show will be back on Thursday. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.